everyone. Welcome to our December episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. Tonight we're going to stick with our theme of the early colonial period and talk about the Hollister site, a site that's near and dear to our hearts and one that OSA and FOSA have been working on for several years. This site is our largest research project and has been an incredibly important vehicle for public archaeology. Over the last 6 years, professional archaeologists, volunteers, and students have come together in a horse pasture in South Glastonbury to learn about archaeology and the colonial history of Connecticut. Tonight we'll be speaking with our friend and collaborator, Mark Packard, who not only owns the property where the site is located, but is also a Hollister family descendant. We'll discuss the history of the site and recap the results of the archaeology to date, and we'll talk with Mark about how the project got started and what it's like to host a long-term archaeological investigation in your backyard. We'll also get Mark's perspective as a descendant of the Hollister family and talk about his experiences as a volunteer archaeologist.
Yeah, we made him get his hands dirty right away, first year.
Thanks, Scott.
So before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your property?
Sure. I'm Mark Packard, lifelong South Glastonbury resident. The property is it's 20 acres on the river. It's belonged to my grandfather since 1922. My uncle took it over after that, after he was done. And my wife and I took over in around 2000. We take care of horses. We take care of other people's horses. And we have too many of our own.
Jiggy.
Hopefully my daughter's not listening. Yes, we have the devil pony Jiggy. If anybody needs one, please let me know. So I worked the farm when I was a kid. From when I was 11 to about 16, 7 days a week, couple hours a day, I and a couple friends would truck down to the farm. I grew up about maybe a mile away. So we ride our bikes down and take care of the horses and pick corn out in the field, whatever my uncle needed doing. That's about it.
So what made you decide to take the farm over?
So when my uncle passed away, we had a big service on the front yard, and all the cousins and brothers and sisters and all family members were there, and everybody who knew my uncle showed up, and the cousins and brothers and sisters, we all looked at each other and said, "Okay, who's moving in?" Because that's the way the neighborhood is. The places don't really go on the market. And my brother was in Boston with 4 kids, and my sister was down there in Wilton with a couple kids, and my cousins had all moved off to Maine and had kids, and my wife and I didn't have any kids, and we were in New Hampshire, and we could easily move home. So we looked at each other, I guess we are. and that was about how it worked.
And it was good for us that you came back.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
I knew that there was something out back. It took a few years to get there.
Yeah, I know. It took a lot of convincing, I think, right? You knew something was there. Now, was there any family stories that kind of led you back there, or was it just a feeling that you had?
So, yeah, getting ready for this show, I actually thought really hard about that. And it started back in the 70s. My uncle, we would go down and work every day, and then my uncle would show up at my house almost every night for dinner. Lots of times he would give me a ride home, and he would show up for dinner, and invariably talking about horses and Glastonbury history. And around 1970 something, Marjorie McNulty comes out with a book called From Settlement to Suburb. In that book, she tells 2 stories about the first house in town. One story says they dragged the house cross lots, and it's the L on the back of the Hollister house on the brook. The other story says my grandfather pulled it up, used it for a chicken coop behind the farmhouse until it fell down, and then they burned up what was left.
Pretty common occurrence from back then. Either one of those stories.
You can guess which story we believed.
Now, I remember when we went out there the first time with Nick, and Brian actually did some work around the well and found some artifacts. But your sister, you were a little perturbed with, because she had kind of said there's a cellar hole off in the woods, right?
Thanks for getting me in trouble, Scott. My sister did kind of point me over towards the fence line, and that seemed to be, by the time we were done, it seemed to be Granddad's dump. Teo, my son, had found he thought it was a pretty historic artifact. It turned out to be, I don't know, what was it, Scott?
It was a 1920s toilet. So, but yeah, I got to say, the technique that he showed on that was pretty impressive. He really committed and spent a lot of time, and we didn't know until the end of the day.
And in defense of my sister, it was about 100 degrees, blazing hot sun, and over there next to the fence, there was a lot of shade under the trees.
Yeah, it was better to be in the shade than Brian being out in the sun that day with Heather, Alex, and digging test pits out by the well.
And another memory of that day is, I'm pretty sure it was Mandy Ranslow. Mandy Ranslow said, you know what? I'm going over there by the well, and I'm going to take a little test pit. And she came back with pig's tooth.
Yeah.
And it was right about then that, it was like, this is looking like there might really be something here.
So did you have a sense at that time that well was as old as it is, that it's 17th century, or did you just think it was an old well?
So the story was that the first house in town was back there. When we moved in, my uncle's best friend, Ralph, lived next door, and he was the one who really got us going with the horses, so we didn't make too many mistakes. Taught us pretty much everything we knew about taking care of horses, and we took care of his horse in return. And because of that story that I had from Marjorie McNulty's book, I asked Ralph, I said, Ralph, do you know anything about the well down there, the first house in town? He says, well, I saw your grandfather sink the corner post to the tobacco shed in the well. I said, well, you think you can find it? And he says, oh, I don't know, we can try. So some time went by. We were out there on the horses one day, and I said, let's see if we can find that well. Now, I know Scott and Sarah, you know that what it looks like out there, but everybody else, I mean, it's a big grass field. There's like there's no landmarks. So we rode the horses back and forth, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes with Ralph looking this way and that. And he finally points at the ground and he says, it's right there. Okay, so the shed went away in the flood of 1938. So the shed had been gone for 80 years. Now Ralph, I love Ralph. He couldn't tell you what he had for lunch. But 80 years was like nothing to him. I watched him do it, things that were 40 years old, and he could pop it. He could tell you exactly, the color of whatever it was he was thinking about. So I marked the spot where Ralph said that's where it was. It's out in the middle of the grass pasture. And, there was an orange cone. You guys have seen pieces of the orange cone. I ran over it with the mower once or twice. I don't know how much time went by, but another friend of mine who came down and helped us, whenever we needed to dig a hole, Dave Draghi would show up with his great big backhoe. And I said, Dave, down there by that orange cone, can you go down there and just take one scoop? So Davey took one scoop of dirt right there, and the round circle of stones from the well was just right there. So Davey, just put it back. That's good. I knew at that point we'd found the well, and the house must be somewhere. So that was like the beginning. It took another couple of years before the Historical Society showed up, and we were hiding over in the woods trying to find something that wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, finding that well I'm impressed by that, because we have the well marked. It's our datum point. We have metal stakes in there so we can find it with a metal detector every year. And this past spring, it took us like an hour and a half to find it until Mark finally came down and showed us where it was.
I know, it's pretty bad.
So I'm pretty impressed that somebody found it after 80 years.
It is hard to believe.
What's amazing is that pasture returns, rejuvenates itself. We always leave the site and go, well, we'll be able to find where we dig when we come back next year so we can start. And we get out there and look, and it, there's nothing. It looks like we've never been there.
It's only been 12 months on the grasses.
Yeah.
It's all back.
Probably because of all the fertilizer that's out there.
The bumps are there, though.
So So I don't know, maybe we should back up a little bit and talk about the site, because I think that we're kind of just
Jumping ahead.
diving right in. And we've
Yeah.
talked about it, it's come up on a lot of different shows and we've talked about it a lot, but I think we probably need to provide some context. Just for everybody who's not familiar with the Hollister site, this is an early colonial farmstead on the Connecticut River in South Glastonbury. It was owned by Lieutenant John Hollister, who lived in Wethersfield proper. And at the time in the 17th century, there were big, large farm lots that were on the east side of the river that were given to people who lived in Wethersfield, usually the big landowners, for farm and pasture and timberland. So these are these big, long kind of strip lots that extended from the river about 3 miles to the east, where they could take advantage of a range of different environments, have access to the river, have access to pasture, farmland, timberlands, that kind of thing. So Hollister himself lived in Wethersfield, and he acquired the land in the 1640s. It belonged to a couple of other people before that, and there's some question about whether or not there was ever any occupation of it, in the 1640s, probably before he got a hold of it. But he didn't live out there himself for the most part. In 1651, he leases the farm to a tenant farm family called the Gilberts, who came from Massachusetts, and they stay on the farm and run it until 1663. Then, from about 1667 to 1711, the farm is occupied by John Hollister's son, John Jr., he basically takes it over when he comes of age and gets married, and he starts a family and settles out there and has a farm. So, we know from the records that it was a working farm throughout its entire history, but we have a lot of interesting questions and a lot of archaeological data that raises possibilities that the site probably goes quite a bit beyond a simple farm.
Oh, yeah. I think there's, we know we have, you've probably heard us talk about GPR, and there's a great GPR study that's been done by Peter Leach and Maeve Henrik and Jasmine Saxon have all contributed to the ground penetrating radar that's been done there. And the picture and the soils out there and the conditions are very conducive to it, and there's all kinds of anomalies and features. We have several wells, we have 6, 7, maybe 8 cellar holes that look like they've been backfilled. There's some other really curious images that we haven't gotten a chance to explore yet. So this is not somebody built a farm and is doing subsistence farming. This is, this certainly appears to be a much bigger operation with a lot of structures and a lot of cellars, which is kind of, I think, a really special and unusual kind of condition, because I can't think of any other site of this era that has that many cellar holes on that small a piece of property.
Yeah, it really brings the word complex to mind, that there's a lot of different things going on there at a given time, because this property is really only occupied and used as a farm for about, 75 years or so. So it's not like there's hundreds and hundreds of years of people building new houses and things like that. So, it's really kind of interesting in that regard. From the ground penetrating radar, they identified numerous features, as Scott was saying, and over the next 6 years, so this all started in about 2015, and over the years between 2015 and the present, there's been 5 field seasons of archaeological work out at the site that have actually focused on the features. So it was a unique situation where the ground penetrating radar really served as kind of a way to hone in on the archaeological features. It didn't require the typical method of survey where you have to dig a bunch of test pits and hope that you find a concentration and then expand from there. They were able to jump right in. When Brian Jones was state archaeologist, and he kind of started this big research project, and actually start looking at these cellars individually and some of the other features, and immediately all kinds of really interesting 17th century artifacts were coming to the surface. Domestic materials, food remains, and the preservation at this site is really kind of astounding. So there's a lot of unique aspects of this site. It's one of the oldest, richest sites from the historic period in Connecticut. The preservation is phenomenal. And it's got fairly good documentation to go along with it. So the potential for telling a really great story is there. But there's also a lot of questions and a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Now, Mark, you're a descendant. what piqued your interest? Was this always kind of a family story that had been passed down, or did you kind of pick this up? And, how did you come to be so, because a lot of us aren't really curious about those descendants or those ancestors.
So about the time I moved home, somewhere in there, I got interested in genealogy. So on one side is my mother, who's lived in South Glastonbury all her life, and generation after generation after generation within a mile of the farm. And on the other side, my father, whose family, the Packards, are all over the country, all kinds of crazy information about where they were. So I had the family tree, and how does that work? Somewhere, and I think it might be in Marjorie McNulty's book again, it says that my grandfather is a lineal descendant of Lieutenant John Hollister. So and then there's the story about the house being in the backyard. Before you know it, I've got the connection. If you go to the Historical Society in Glastonbury, you'll see paintings on the back wall, and that's Jedediah Post, who's 4 generations back. The whole family history is right there.
Yeah, they stayed in one place, so it was easy to find, right?
It was easy to find.
Well, as easy as it can be in genealogy. It's not always that easy.
It was pretty easy. A lot of good stories about the GPR. The GPR, when it first started, I think it was Brian showed up. If it wasn't Brian, it was Nick Bellantoni. Nick Bellantoni showed up, and they had GPR on a sled.
Yes.
And we knew where the well was, so we started from the well, and their GPR, and I don't know, a couple hours worth of work in the hot sun, and they did a 20-foot by 30-foot section. I think it was 2013, and we didn't find anything. It was hard work, and nothing came of it. And I'm trying to think. I think the next day we were in the woods. Yeah, we were in the woods.
No, you're right. I think
looking for stuff.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And then the day Peter Leach shows up, and Peter Leach is hooking up his equipment. Peter Leach has wheels on his equipment.
It's revolutionary.
And we've got an awesome picture of a horse named Sage, and Sage is actually working the GPR. That's a whole other story. And Brian looks at me and says, "Well, Mark, it's a really neat site and everything, but even if we do find something, we're probably not going to dig. We like to keep it in the ground. We don't want to bring it out if we don't have to. It's better preserved in the ground." And I said, "That's okay. All I really want to know is if it's there." And about that time, Peter Leach has the equipment hooked up, and within 10 minutes he goes, "Oh, there's a cellar." And about 5 minutes later he goes, "Hey, Brian, there's another cellar." It was quite the day.
Yeah. And I think, again, there's another archaeologist who said, this is unique. And I really think that those anomalies are unique. I can't think of a place that's like this. But again, as we were saying before, that adds to the whole question. I mean, why so many cellars? If those are all house cellars, are they parts of big structures, a couple houses? Are they all individual houses? There's so many questions out there that we haven't dug enough yet, so we'll need to come back next year.
Here we go. Brian was always trying to tie the 3 cellars together into a 90-foot long house. That was his thing. And Sarah, you found some dark stain that looked like a sill this year.
Yeah, I know, it's really interesting. I mean, I do think that there's no question that those cellars, at least 2 of them or maybe more, do fit together into larger structures. It's not at all uncommon to have partial cellars under a house, right, where part of it's just on the ground and part of it's in the and part of it has a cellar. It's a lot of work to dig a cellar, even in the nice sandy soils of your pasture. But I think that the problem is that it's just, to figure that out and how these all connect, you have to go wider and wider and wider and keep opening up. I mean, you see people, in the Chesapeake when they dig, they just take a they basically just take a backhoe and scrape the top off, and then all the features are exposed. But that's not something that we'd want to do, because the artifacts in the plow zone are actually really important indicators of what's going on below, because we know from experimental research that artifacts don't tend to move laterally when they've been plowed. They move up and down. They kind of stay right where they are. At this site, the plow zone is full of really interesting 17th century artifact, an incredible preservation for a soil that's was repeatedly turned over year after year after year. I mean, this year we found a Jesuit ring in the plow zone. In past years, Scott, I wasn't there that year, but Scott said they turned over the duff and found a glass trade bead just right under the grass. So the idea of
scraping all that good stuff off is
there's a lot
sacrilege.
of information there, I think.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not something that we're willing to give up. But so it'll be a slower process than it would be if we just scraped the top off and figured it out. But
So I always find it amazing when you take a picture from one year and a picture from another year, and then you lay I don't even know what it's called, but you put a nice colored rectangle where the cellar is. And to me, it makes it possible the way you do it on the grid, and the grids can, you can fit it all back together after the fact.
Right, we'll add it to the map every year. We'll keep adding to the drawing, so even if things are covered up, we'll still be able to visualize them. And the drone photography is great. That was the thing that we did this year. We exposed a big area. We are very confident now that we have earth-fast construction. So a house that was built, it has a cellar. The cellar is not stone-lined, but the house itself was built with a series of posts and sills and things like that. So not your typical, frame structure that you'd think of from like a colonial house from the 18th century or something along that lines, more like the little houses they have at Plymouth Plantation and things like that, where they put posts in the ground and, use those as the basis for the structure. So we're starting to get a better sense of the architecture. But another interesting thing about the site is the variety of what appear to be architectural styles out there. We've got wood-lined cellars and stone-lined cellars and sills and posts, and this year I think we got some hints of some hearths that are probably fireplaces, but not necessarily associated with chimneys, or if they are associated with chimneys, those chimneys would have also been earth fast rather than have built out of stone or brick. So I think we're starting to get really interesting information about the earliest colonial period architecture here in southern New England, which is something we don't have a lot of information about to date.
So just tell our listeners to be clear. So Mark lives in the house still, and there's a barn there, so that's where you keep the horses. So on the 20 acres, that's where somewhere in that area where you're finding all these things. And Mark, is there a certain area, or I guess maybe I should ask either one of you. I'm just curious because Mark is the person who
it belongs
lives with all this stuff. Is there a certain area in that 20 acres that you're looking? Is it, are you going, area by, like acre by acre? How is that working? Just so that our listeners can get an idea and lay it out in their own, little heads to see what it looks like.
So Sarah, take them back to the well.
Yeah, so the starting point for all of this is the well, which is a significant distance from the current house and barn.
It is.
Yes.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you picture kind of what I was talking about, the long strip lots that extend from the river inland, basically to the east, right? They're long and narrow. And, in the 1600s, the roads weren't there. There weren't a lot of houses there. Very few people even lived on this side of the river. It was kind of the frontier. It was farmland, and then it was just wilderness. So at that point in time, the river was the road. It was the major transportation route. It was the focus of everything, right? It was how you move goods. It was how you move people. It was how you moved information. So the part of the site that we're investigating is close to the river, whereas the modern settlement is all focused up on the roads. So, that's a thing. And basically, once they had the well, they had a starting point to go outward from there with the GPR. So it's actually not a very large area where we're finding all of this stuff. It's nowhere near 20 acres. It's, I don't know the exact dimensions of the area where we've been working, but
I don't think the cellars that we've worked on are more than a couple acres. And also, I mean, I guess we should point out that we have done a fairly large area with the GPR, but we certainly haven't done all of the property. So there may still be some secrets out there that are hiding from us. But I think that at the rate we're going, and with the number of features and anomalies and things that are in the ground that we can see right now, it's going to take us a long time to process that. To go looking for more now might not be the wisest choice for us.
Well, we should tell our listeners, too, you can go to your Facebook page. That's where I saw the photos. And so I was trying to, while you guys are talking, figure out the photos to what I know of that. I know that land. And so I'm thinking, well, where is it? How does it, is it a huge space? Because from the pictures, I don't know if they're all together or are those photos spread out. You know what I mean?
No, all these basements or cellar holes are fairly close together. I mean,
like what?
Like 30 meters, maybe,
yeah.
which is like
100 feet.
100 feet, 200 feet, not very far apart.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if people do want to learn more about the site, and I don't think that it's up yet, but the Archaeological Society of Connecticut has hosted a series of virtual talks this year. I gave one on the Hollister site, and the video of that should be up on the website in the near future. So it kind of lays out the whole background of the archaeological research, what we found to date, what we're thinking, our future directions, and that kind of thing. So if you want to find more information out about it, that would be a great place. The Archaeological Society of Connecticut's website would have that information soon.
But, as Sarah was saying, one of the interesting things about this is, I think we know about the founding of Connecticut and what happened here early on. Basically, what we're seeing on this site is kind of telling us we maybe are making some assumptions that we've kind of fallen into this idea of what we think's happening, and that may not be true everywhere, particularly on this site, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think as far as the archaeological community was concerned for a long time, they had a few very widespread misconceptions about the early colonial period. One was that all the sites had been destroyed or overprinted by later development, that you couldn't find them. Two was that, what people were doing and how they were living was not all that different from the standing structures that we associate with the colonial period. By that, we usually mean the 18th century, not the 17th century. The people had these big boxy wooden houses with chimneys and, their fence lines and barns and all that stuff weren't that different. But when we start to get into the archaeological record, you realize that the early settlement period was a period of, a lot of expedient architecture, things that were set up quickly, that were meant to last a few years maybe while you built something better. And to find the traces of that means you're finding the traces of the very earliest period of English settlement, which is a time of, tremendous change and adaptation and, getting used to a new environment, dealing with all kinds of complicated cultural and political and economic issues with trades with native people and things like that. And that's another thing I think that we should talk a little bit about is the archaeological record of the interactions between colonists and native people in the early colonial period, because the Hollister site has a very clear record of that, a material record of that, I think, which is something that can be difficult to tease out of the archaeological record.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has amazed me the most about this site is, I had been digging for about 5 years before I went out there, or so 3 or 4 years anyway, and the largest pieces of native-made ceramic that I had found was one piece, and it was the size of my fingernail. I did 3 meters the first year we really excavated at Hollister with any kind of ambition and guidance from the GPR. And I myself took out 100 pieces of native pottery the size of the palm of my hand from one cellar. So, and there was native pottery in at least 2 of the 3 cellars, in substantial amounts. So what that kind of led us to believe is that, maybe a small piece of native pottery on that site from pre-contact period could have survived, getting tromped on by horses and people and maybe fallen into a cellar. But that many large pieces, and we have a number of pieces that actually refit, so we've started to rebuild these vessels, indicate that these were whole native ceramics that were in the cellars of the Hollisters and the Gilberts maybe before them. That, makes sense, whether, it was because the English settlers needed ceramics and storage vessels, and maybe they're not available, that well yet. Maybe the trade network isn't that well established. It could be gifting between the Wangang people that are living on that site and the Europeans. It could be purchasing going back and forth. But it certainly is indicative that there's some kind of an interaction that seems to be somewhat beneficial to both sides, at least in my opinion, in those cellars. That pottery indicates that. Is that fair, do you think, Sarah?
I do think so. And I think that, if you study the history of the early colonial period, it's very clear that Native people and Europeans are interacting on a number of different levels, right? Not all of those interactions are positive, but they're not all negative either. There's trade. And particularly in the first few years of settlement, the English are desperate to buy food from Native people because they don't have their own. They haven't established their farms yet. They don't have crops. They need to buy stored corn and things like that. So, it could also be a container that came in, when you purchased it. I mean, that's just one possibility. But there's lots of different material. And maybe, we should step back a little bit. Mark, from your research, can you tell us a little bit about some of the stories about the relationship between the Hollisters and the Wangungs and people, there is documentation of some of this.
So while I was listening to you, I was thinking about the piece of paper that came from the Glastonbury Historical Society about amix. So this little, just a one-sheet piece of paper. I don't think there was any name on who came up with the information, but it was about an Indian girl, Native American girl named Amix, A-M-I-X. And it told the story of how Amix used to come over and learn how to sew from Mrs. Hollister. And about the time we came up with that piece of paper, somebody pulled out a thimble. And it was, I just saw it today on the website. There's a picture of it. And it's described as a very small, like for a child's finger. So between that and the piece of paper that said Amix came over to learn to sew, it was just amazing.
Yeah, it's the smallest thimble I've ever seen. I mean, I don't know that means, that it fits into this story, but it certainly leads you to think that, maybe there is something there. The other thing about that story is, I thought, well, why would a Native person need to keep coming back to learn how to sew? I mean, Native people were sewing their own clothing, okay, maybe with hides and maybe not with some of the textiles, but it seemed like it's something that they would pick up pretty quickly. And a few years ago, we were having someone review some of the artifacts we had found from one of the cellar holes, and we didn't really know what we were calling them, but we had these things, and they looked at them and they said, "Oh, those are tatting needles. These are needles designed for making lace." Now, right away the thought in my head went to, okay, maybe making lace is something that really requires lessons. And again, we can't say for sure that that's her thimble or that, or verify that story. But it's just another one of those little pieces of evidence that seem to give it a little bit of credence that you really go, okay, something's going on there for this story to survive this long.
Yeah, and we have, there's other stories and documentation of the Hollisters and the Gilberts with their interactions with Native people. Two of the Gilbert brothers, they didn't necessarily live on the site, but they were involved in leasing it. Served as interpreters for Connecticut Colony. They went out on diplomatic missions. They talked to Native people. They interacted with them on a regular basis about, really contentious issues like, because for many years between the Pequot War and King Philip's War, the relationships were very tense, and there was many times when conflict almost boiled over, right? So there were lots of instances that required diplomacy where people, and they clearly had the ability to speak the language and, to interact in culturally appropriate ways. So there seems to have been a lot of connection there between various Native groups from the Wangung, the Narragansett, the Pecumtucks, all across the region. There's evidence that the family was involved with the fur trade and the West Indies trade. There's all kinds of really interesting historical tidbits. And in a couple of months, we're probably going to have Walt Woodward come on and talk about some of that and kind of situate the site in the broader historical context of the 17th century, which is a thing that we'd really like to do. Other evidence of interaction with Native people in the historical record comes from the period of King Philip's War, where the Hollisters provided land at Red Hill for the Wangungs to build a fortified settlement in preparation for what they believed to be the coming hostilities. It didn't actually really come to fruition on the Connecticut River there in South Glastonbury, but they were preparing for it, and they were, working together basically to store away food supplies in preparation for what people really thought was an impending, conflict that was coming their way.
And, I think the last thing that I would bring up kind of on that native kind of a line of what's out there that kind of leads us to believe that there's that relationship is the foodways, the faunal remains. And that's your specialty, Sarah. Can you give us just a little taste of what it is that you're actually seeing in those bones that have been so well preserved?
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit a couple of years ago on the show, back when Dan Forrest was hosting. I think Walt Woodward was on and I was on, and we were talking about the Webdene-Stevens site and the Hollister site. So for those of you who aren't familiar or forgotten, the Webdene-Stevens site was a 17th century site that in Wethersfield proper, in Old Wethersfield, that dates to the 1630s and 40s. So really the founding of Wethersfield, and probably a little bit earlier than the Hollister site. And a site had been found there around 2017, and there was a fair amount of animal bones that were recovered. But the sample of those that we looked at looked a lot more, it was mostly domesticated animals with some wild species thrown in, some deer and some wild birds and things like that, but a lot of cow and pig and what you would expect from an agricultural society. The Hollister assemblages are completely different. It's all wild animals. It's like 80% wild species, dominated by deer, but there's turtles and all kinds of fish, birds, small animals like raccoons and squirrels and skunks and muskrats and weasels and all kinds of things. Some of these animals are fur bearers, which is really interesting. But the at least in the deposits that I've looked at so far, the contribution of domesticated animals is minimal, which is really intriguing because we know from the documents that they had farm animals on these sites. So what are they doing with them?
Yeah, and I wonder, how much does that possibly indicate that, you have these native relationships that are teaching you about, how to eat a skunk, right? I mean, if that's the case, there are certain animals that, in ways of catching and cooking and preparing food and hunting that maybe they're learning from those native neighbors that they're assisting with over the course of their time on the site.
Yeah, I mean, in hunting would have been a skill that a lot of English settlers would have needed to learn when they came here, because a lot of people weren't permitted to hunt game in England because of, those game reserves were kind of reserved for the nobility, and, you could catch rabbits and small birds and things like that, which most human farmers did to supplement their diets, but the ability to go out and hunt game was actually, it was status-based. So that's kind of an interesting, aspect of that would be a skill you'd need to learn. Another question is maybe, we know from the documents, we have probate records from a couple of different time periods, from Thomas Gilbert, who is the father of that family who died in 1659. We have Lieutenant Hollister's probate from 1665, and then we have John Jr.'s probate from 1711. They all have domesticated animals out there. They're clearly raising animals. But what are they doing with them? And that raises a lot of interesting questions about trade and exactly what kind of agriculture, because we tend to think of farms as subsistence level farms at this time period, but there's a good possibility here that there may have been a more complicated economic thing going on where people are selling their livestock, and one possible outlet for that is the West Indies.
Yeah, and we found a piece of coral at the site this year. I've never seen that on a site. I know Sarah has on a few sites, but it's not very common, and it's probably ballast that came over in a ship out of the Caribbean. So, that connection maybe is coming home with a little bit of supported archaeological evidence. It's going to require more research, I think, on our part to kind of confirm that, but it's a really interesting take on another aspect of the site.
Yeah, and when you look back at the historical record, the West Indies trade really picks up in the late 17th century and the 18th century. But people are doing it earlier, right? The fur trade is the first big thing, but the fur trade starts to wane in the 1650s, and there are some people like John Pynchon up in Springfield, who are starting to diversify even as early as the 1650s and start to get involved with the West Indies trade. So in this case, in the Caribbean, they have these sugar plantations, right? And then they're processing sugar, or they're producing sugar and molasses and rum and things like that. It's incredibly lucrative. And there's a desire to not waste time growing food, basically. So they start buying their food from the colonies up in North America. So people are shipping barreled meat, they're shipping wood, timber, barrel staves, grain, all kinds of stuff down to the Caribbean fairly early, actually. So there's a possibility that it could be involved in that trade as well.
So another favorite story, right back to the bones, and it always amazes me of the knowledge of the people that are out there on the site. So one day somebody said, "Hey, I found this cool bone," and they're showing it around like you do when you find something really neat, and somebody takes a look at it and goes, "Hey, you know what? That's a metatarsal." It's like, I don't know what a metatarsal is. Do you know what a metatarsal is? It turns out a metatarsal is that bone like on the back of your hand between your wrist and your finger. But this metatarsal was 9 inches long. So how big a hand was this? It turns out it was from a great big arthritic bear. It was so cool, and somebody actually looked at the bone and knew, what part of the skeleton it came from.
Yeah, and that sent Brian down, the what could it be? Is it an arthritic bear that comes in and we know they have an apple orchard out there and is eating all their apples, so they go, well, we got to take care of him? Or is it possibly, part of the fur trade? Again.
Or
bear.
Just dinner.
Or just dinner, sure.
Or it was after that pig.
Yeah, that's right.
And we wanted to trade that pig for some molasses.
Although at that point in time, I think most pigs could probably take care of themselves because, we don't have this anymore, but they had huge tusks and people just let them run wild, which was another point of contention with the Native American neighbors who, they didn't necessarily fence their fields and crops and things like that. And the European domesticated animals wreaked havoc because they let them just wander the landscape. Pigs would travel around in packs and they had their big tusks and they would just root for food and basically feed themselves. They were easy. But if they happened to run into somebody's garden, it would be a huge problem. So, but the idea was that, a group of them could probably fend off wolves if it came down to it because they were so rough and tough and with those big giant tusks that you just don't see anymore. And we find them at the site. We found several of those giant tusks, which are really cool.
And modern day pigs are big and kind of mean. They don't have the tusks, but I wouldn't want to tussle with one of them.
But imagine if they did.
I know.
So, hey, Sarah, how about talking about the people that actually do all the work and all the different types of people?
No, yeah, and that's the thing that we really wanted to talk about tonight was the Hollister site as a really important vehicle for public archaeology. From the beginning, from the get-go, this has not been, a purely academic project or a purely professional project. It's involved people from across Connecticut and some other states, too, that have come in and joined through a series of field schools, volunteer digs, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, college students, historical society groups, including the Historical Society of Glastonbury, which comes out every year and does a day or two of volunteer digging. We've been able to, over the years, between Brian, when he was state archaeologist and running the project, and even this year, which was the first year we were able to come back after COVID and actually do a field program to really just get a lot of people involved and give people a very hands-on experience, to connect them to history, to past, to our shared, at least colonial history here in Connecticut.
Yeah, I think that I started thinking about that and looking back over the time. There's been hundreds of volunteers that have come out to this site and at least spent a day or a lot of them, many more, including some of the FOSA people who have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours individually on the site. But 8 to 80 Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, college students, other Hollister descendants that have, found the site online and reached out and said, could I come out and dig on a place where, my descendants live or my ancestors live? So it's been a huge I think, important part, not only because the research they're doing is important, and quite honestly, the work that gets done out there, without volunteers, it can't happen. I mean, there's no budget, there's no staff, there's no ability to do this kind of work because it is very, very labor intensive without all these volunteers.
But I'm kind of overwhelmed by Mark's graciousness and generosity for allowing that to go on your property. So how is it for you? And what are your favorite parts of this happening?
So my favorite parts are being able to share the farm, right? We live on this rather amazing piece of property, and we do enjoy sharing it. We have the horses, and we have people that come in and keep their horses there, and we enjoy being able to look out the window at the horses. Maybe not so much in February. The rest of the year is pretty good. And having the Boy Scouts. My son was a Cub Scout, and having the Boy Scouts out. The Boy Scouts actually came out and helped us do a 1% survey. So I didn't know what a 1% survey was.
I don't either. So, and our listeners probably won't. So,
okay,
what is that?
So Brian lays out from the well, every meter at a square grid, and he does. Let me know if I get this wrong. A 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter square in the corner of each one of those 1 meter squares. And that works out to 1%. And he did that over, and we had probably 20 or 30 Boy Scouts out there, and we divvied up, and the kids went out there and they dug all their holes, and it was amazing. These kids are, anywhere between 8 and 16 years old. And, they're coming up going, what's this? And they've got a pipe stem from 1650 in their hand.
Yeah.
And we found a few pipe stems. It was amazing that they could just find, they weren't going very deep. They were going maybe 10 or 20 centimeters. And I think everybody found something.
Right there is, I know that we've converted Mark because he went to 10 or 20 centimeters.
Right, not like
we work in centimeters, and everybody else is in inches for the most part. So we've really hooked them in now.
Yeah, and that kind of raises two things. One is that one of the reasons why this site is so well preserved and why you're finding 17th century artifacts in what's essentially the soil that's been plowed over and over again is that this site was abandoned around 1711 and nothing else was ever built there. And that's very unusual. Lots of times the earlier sites have lots of stuff that's been built on top. So you're trying to tease out, a few hundred years of stuff and try to figure out what dates back to the earliest period and how it all fits together. Here, that's all there is. The record stops right around the turn of the 18th century. So you have you know what you've got when you've got it, and that's really been borne out by the artifacts that we found. The other thing, talking about that stuff is just, and every archaeologist understands that that's why we do it. That's why we put up with the bad pay and the uncomfortable working conditions. But it's that visceral kind of hands-on experience of touching something that no one else has seen or touched for hundreds of years. It's amazing. It's astounding, and it's a connection to history that's really hard. It's cool to hear about interesting, the past and interesting history and interesting sites, but to actually be there and to touch it and to see it yourself is a completely different experience, and it really draws people in, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the great thing that comes from all these volunteers, besides the research and the work that we get from them, that helps the research along, is they leave this understanding that Connecticut does have a lot of archaeology. I think a lot of people don't think about that. There's an incredible amount of the story of, the United States of America, of the British colonies, of the indigenous people who lived here for 12,000 years, and it's across the state, and it's in everybody's backyard or, in their town. And so when they leave there, I think that maybe, hopefully, I think one of the messages that we try to give them is think about this in your town. Be aware of it, and maybe, be concerned about certain things that are going to happen in your town that maybe should be checked. Maybe an archaeologist should come out and check before they build a big superstore or shopping center or something.
Yeah, and in many cases there are laws and regulations in place that will ensure that they do, but sometimes at the town level that doesn't happen, and it is a grassroots kind of effort that's required, to preserve these sites or at least get them the attention they deserve before they might be destroyed by development. So, bridging that gap and getting people to understand that this stuff is out there and that it's significant and that there are really interesting stories to be told is a huge part of historic preservation and archaeological preservation. And it's a way to, bring everybody into it because it is our shared past and our shared history. And we're all responsible, for it on some level.
Sarah, we got a question from a listener who asked, does what you found in Glastonbury, did you mean at the beginning of the show that it rivals anything to do with Wethersfield being first or Windsor, that whole story? Does this put South Glastonbury anywhere in the running?
No, it doesn't.
That's the question.
No,
Okay.
so the first three towns are Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford, and Wethersfield and Windsor go back and forth with their argument. And I've stepped into that battle before. I'm not going to do it today, but I think that what this is basically is an offshoot of the Wethersfield settlement. So it's extra land, so people were living close together in a town in Wethersfield, and they needed farmland. That's a lot of the reason why people came to Connecticut from Massachusetts was for farmland. So this land on the other side of the river are these big grants of farmland that people have that, they're associated with their property. They're using them. They're profiting from them. But
And technically, it's still part of Wethersfield.
it
Right,
is,
that's
at the
where I was
time.
gonna
It's
go.
Wethersfield, yeah. It is, that's true. But it's not as early as the archaeological material that was found at the Webdean-Stevens site.
So even though it's across the river?
Yeah. Yep.
I know that Rocky Hill was Wethersfield, right? Rocky
Yes.
Hill was
Yeah.
Yeah.
a part. So South Glastonbury, or that area,
So-
was even on the other side of the water.
Back at the beginning where Sarah said that the farms were laid out in 3-mile long strips,
Yes.
those strips are all Wethersfield up to 1693. In 1693, Glastonbury becomes its own town, and Wethersfield is no more on the east side of the river, except for that little spot up there by
Right.
Keeney Cove.
And I think, like we were saying before, that's kind of the reason maybe this site is preserved, right? Now that 1693, Glastonbury is its own town, now you don't have to go across the river for safety or to trade or to go to church. Now you go up and put your house further up on the hill because Glastonbury is where you need to go. That's the settlement. That's your social network. That's your safety network. That's probably your business network to some extent at that point, too.
And why would you guess nothing has been developed in that area? I mean, it couldn't be more gorgeous. So how come there is no other? Is it because the Hollisters have held on to their land all this time?
Well, that's certainly a part of it. I mean, there's a lot of land along the river that remains undeveloped, but there's also a lot of it that has been developed. And I think that, keeping it in one family, for a long time, or at least in several families that are, doing agriculture and horses and things like that have played a role. But a big part of it is just that land was no longer a place where people wanted to live. They wanted to, the town becomes the focus of people's settlement. So you're moving away from the river, which sort of becomes the backyard as opposed to the front yard. It's the front yard in the 1650s, 60s, 70s, and by the time you go into the 1700s, it's the back.
And I think one of the other
interesting.
one of the other important things is I also think that it's it's great farmland today. A matter of fact, the farm next door, the Horton farm, is another multi-generational family that's been on that property, and they're still farming it. And again, I think the great thing about Mark and people like the Hortons is they're not just property owners; they're stewards of the land. Mark, like he said, he wants to share that property. You can stand in that field, and if you look at the river and ignore, don't look up the hill to where it's modern, that's probably pretty close to what it looked like in 1650 when the first, Europeans built their little dugout to take care of their little housing to take care of the animals that were over there. And so people like Mark and the Hortons and all those other people along that strip from almost probably Portland all the way up into Windsor, have been a big part of the preservation of that land and the care of it. And it leads us that, there's probably some other interesting discoveries to be made along that stretch of the river.
And it floods.
And it floods, too.
Right,
True.
but not where this site is.
So there's things called the 100-year flood line and the 500-year flood line. And I've seen the site underneath probably 4 feet of water in my lifetime. There's that last house on Ferry Lane, just before you get to the ferry boat on the left side. I've seen water on the first floor. My mother's seen water on the second floor.
Wow.
So there's a place that's called the Great Meadows. It's Weathersfield, Rocky Hill, and Glastonbury. And there's about 4,500 acres of farmland in the Great Meadows. If you eat green beans in the greater Hartford area, you probably eat green beans from the Great Meadows. And not too many people know it. They drive by on 91 and don't think too much about it. But if you live down there, you can hear the green bean washing machine, going at all times of day and night. So,
Mark, I'm curious, what is your favorite thing that has come out of the site? Like the most, your absolute favorite thing, and for what reason?
well, can I have more than one?
Sure.
Okay, so if you've ever held a fish in your hand and you move the tail back and forth, it's like, why does that work? So my daughter was down there one day and she's digging and she pulls out a skeleton and she's got a fish skeleton in her hand, and that bone where the tail goes back and forth is still connected and it's still working. And she'll tell that story today.
How old was she when she found it?
She's probably 16 or 17.
Oh, how great. That's terrific.
And then Teo was down at depth one day because they actually let him work down. As long as Scott's sitting on the side of the excavation, they might let him dig. And he pulled out a bone, which, lots of times you would never know what it is, but he pulled out the breastplate of a turtle.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
It was cool. And he knew what he found.
And how old might he have been?
Oh,
he was 12 or 13.
Yeah.
Oh, I just love that. The kids are, they're able to experience that.
Yeah, we've got the whole family out there,
Yeah.
digging in the ground and finding cool stuff.
And other people.
And tell them about the Northern Italian slipware. Come on.
Yes, so Brian was always the Northern Italian slipware. So he had dug a hole, and it was, probably Brian probably had somebody else dig the hole.
Could be.
I love you, Brian. It was like right in the roadway, which always gets me because I've got this laneway, and whenever there's a excavation done, it makes a bump when you drive over it. And he had some folks in there, and I think they were in there for 2 or 3 days, and they didn't find very much, and they had to go home like Wednesday at around lunchtime. And Brian said, "Mark, can you go finish off that quad over there?" So within 5 minutes, I pulled out Northern Italian slipware, which it's a very fancy pottery from near the town of Pisa in Italy.
Yeah, it's Italian ceramics that we know is super popular in the area in Europe in the 1500s, but it's still out there in the 1600s as we move into the 17th century.
Yeah. Well, we're wrapping up, so let's talk about, you can follow us at osa.uconn.edu and our Facebook page. And as I said, if you want to learn more about the Hollister site, it'll be on the Archaeological Society of Connecticut website very soon.
Sure, FOSA, you can check us out. We have a Facebook page too, or our website is fosa-ct.org.
And thanks so much, Mark, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. And make sure you join FOSA and come out and dig some dirt.
That's right.